Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. My name is Tom Loftus. I'll be leading us through this concise and hopefully very informative webinar on a new approach to conflict-free service. Again, this is part two of a two-part series on addressing conflicts. So for those of you on the line who did participate in part one, apologies in advance. There may be a little bit of redundancy from what you had heard on the previous installment, but certainly some new good content here as well. That said, I'm going to wait about another 45 seconds to a minute to make sure that all of our attendees have had a chance to dial into the call. So please do hang tight and we'll get started here very shortly. Okay, it looks like we had a few last minute dials in here, so we can go ahead and get going. Before I do jump into the content of the presentation, I do want to remind our participants today that if a question does come up during the call, you do have on your screen a poll box where you can go ahead and pose a question, which we do have some time reserved at the end of the webinar to address. And if time does run tight, we will certainly follow up with you to a response to whatever question you might have. So that said, let's get going. Slide one here, a summary of conflict of interest concerns. And so conflicts of interest have long been a detriment to the financial services industry. They're nothing new, and plan sponsors as plan fiduciaries have always had a responsibility to identify and evaluate potential conflicts of interest to avoid fiduciary liability. But more recently, there's been additional emphasis placed on conflicts of interest and addressing those. And so these bullet points here on slide one really summarize the bulk of what we covered in the first installment of this two-part webinar series on conflicts of interest. So I'll recap very briefly here, but the way that I like to break this slide down is into three main categories related to conflicts: the why, the what, and the where. So the why. Why have conflict of interest concerns become more prominent recently? The first bullet point, the DOL has been spotlighting conflicts of interest. That's certainly very true. And I'm sure at least everyone on the line is vaguely familiar with what's now the defunct fiduciary rule imposed by the DOL to encourage additional disclosure and additional removal of conflicts from service provider and plan sponsor relationships. Pair that with the recent higher education lawsuits that have come about over the last 3 years. While it's certainly not the only point of the lawsuits, conflict of interest has been brought up. A very key example was in the case of MIT. The plaintiffs brought about the claim that MIT had not sufficiently or not adequately evaluated Fidelity as the plan's record keeper and therefore was in breach of their fiduciary duty. The acknowledgement of the conflict of interest that existed there was that one of MIT's board members was actually an executive at Fidelity, and Fidelity had been contributing money to the institution for a number of years. So certainly a perceived issue with conflicts of interest there that were brought up in that lawsuit, and that's just one of several examples. So I mentioned the why, the what, and the where. Moving to the what, the next few bullet points highlights a few key areas that we at Plan Pilot have identified as being some of the more common areas within the dynamics of your retirement plan that may pose potential threats for conflicts of interest. The first, plan rollovers and the potential for significantly increased cost. A relatively routine transaction for plan participants that are separating or otherwise removing themselves from the 403B plan involves rolling over assets into a qualified IRA or elsewhere. And oftentimes participants have questions about how or whether it makes sense to roll their money out of the plan. And with an IRA or separate brokerage account, there are certainly money management fees that are involved. And what has been acknowledged is that whether it's at the record keepers or based on the record keeper's advice or at their discretion, or whether it's based on affiliate of the record keeper or an IRA provider, there's a conflict of interest between giving advice on rolling over assets and whether or not that's truly in a participant's best interest, or whether it's simply a means of generating additional revenue outside of the retirement plan. The second example here that we shared, data sharing and cross-selling of products and services to your plan participants. This is actually a point that was brought about very recently with the information provided related to the Vanderbilt University settlement. And the acknowledgement there was that participants' data maintained by the record keeper was being shared and used to cross-sell products to those plan participants based on their demographics and other factors related to their retirement plan participant profile. Certainly, there's a conflict of interest there if data is being harvested on plan participants and products and other services are being sold that may not be in that participant's best interest. Not only is this increasingly relevant because it was brought up in the Vanderbilt settlement, but in general, the industry is moving towards fee compression. Certainly, there are competitive pressures and other technological efficiencies that have put pressure on record keepers and other providers to bring down their prices on, for example, record keeping costs. Well, this is certainly a very positive thing for you, the plan sponsor, in paying your record keeper fees. This has also put pressure on record keepers and other providers to build revenue streams elsewhere and build and offer other services that can drive revenue where record keeper revenue may be lacking more recently. So another opportunity or potential for a conflict of interest there. The third bullet point we have towards the bottom in the what category, I call it, the service providers receiving indirect revenue and the risk of these hidden costs. So there's an acknowledgement that there are hard fees that all service providers are receiving, but what has become increasingly clear is that there are more indirect revenue arrangements that different providers might have. Whether or not they're totally legitimate is beside the point. The fact of the matter is there's acknowledgement that not all fees that are being paid are being explicitly disclosed, and even those that are, oftentimes there's some gray area regarding where and what those fees are going to pay. So I sum it all up at the bottom here with our last bullet point. I covered the why conflicts are prominent, what major conflicts We Plan Pilot are seeing in the industry, and now the where, the third point that I mentioned. Revenue generation versus participants' best interest. That sums it all up very well. As a plan fiduciary, your responsibility as that fiduciary is to be acting in the best interest of your plan participants. And when you engage service providers, oftentimes those providers are signing on as co-fiduciaries to your participants, and other times they're not. But that does not relieve you of the fiduciary obligation to oversee that service provider's practices and ensuring that they are acting or presenting services and products that are really in your participants' best interest. And so the conflict comes about when those best interests of participants are conflicted with opportunities to generate additional revenue, whether or not that's with the positioning of services or products or other things that may not truly be in the best interest of your participants. participants. Page 2, a little bit more recap from our previous installment here on addressing and avoiding conflicts of interest. So the first point on this page, understanding shortcomings with the required disclosure process. From a plan participant perspective, you're required as a service provider to disclose to participants the fees that they're paying for the services and the investments that they're using in the retirement plan. At the same time, your service providers are required to disclose their fees to you, the plan sponsor, to give you clear indication of what you are paying for and the services that you're receiving for what you are paying. The issue here is multifaceted. I'll say one, while there is formality around these disclosures and the frequency with which they must be distributed, there is a fair amount of leeway in the way that these disclosures are constructed. And so when you couple that with what's a pervasive issue in the digital world that we live in today, and that's information overload. Oftentimes you're receiving multiple communications from your service providers if you're a plan sponsor. If you're a plan participant, you're receiving communications more frequently from your record keeper. It's often difficult to disseminate which pieces of information you're receiving really do require your close attention. And at the same time, the fee disclosures themselves often tend to be very, very heavily loaded with information to the point where the average reader may feel overwhelmed or more prone to completely disconnect from it in its entirety. Lastly, I'll mention that these types of disclosures do not have any type of call to action for you, the plan sponsor, or for your plan participant. So certainly think of any email that you receive coming across your inbox on a daily basis. If there is that call to action, the likelihood of you engaging more closely with that email is limited, and that's an unfortunate reality, but a notable shortcoming of these required disclosures. So where we're going to focus a bulk of the rest of our time together this morning is on the identification process for identifying conflicts of interest. And at a high level, we introduced this concept last time, but spending more time today on how to identify conflicts with service providers. And so the bullet points that we have here on the page all tie back to one central theme: asking for information and getting that information in writing. So the most thorough way to identify or to better assess whether your service providers may be posing potential conflicts of interest is through what's called a formal request for proposal or a condensed request for information process. This is a formal written questionnaire that can be tailored around any line of service or any type of product offered by a provider, but in this case, focused around the concept of conflicts of interest. An excellent opportunity to request detailed information from your provider. It can be a bit exhaustive for a full RFP or RFI process, and if that's not the route that you're looking to go, a simple questionnaire drafted and sent to a plan provider could get a higher level, but certainly still an adequate level of information from that provider on where there might be conflicts of interest outstanding. The last bullet point we have here, this would certainly be the most thorough evaluation of your plan that you could have, and that's through getting outside assistance, engaging a qualified partner who as a profession is identifying conflicts of interest that exist between service providers and plan sponsors. That group or that person could spend more time more subjectively assessing the services and products that are being used in your retirement program, and can go through and identify whether or not they're glaring conflicts of interest or where there may even be the perception that something that's being delivered to your plan may be a conflict. So this is great information, but a natural question that could be begged at this point is how do you get started? The idea for an RFP or an RFI certainly makes a lot of sense and should resonate. But what types of questions do you ask? Where do you really begin? And that's where page 3 here frames that information very well. And so on page 3 we have a list of general questions that you can ask a service provider to identify potential conflicts of interest. And I'll pause here for a second to clarify 2 things. The first being, we will certainly be providing these slides after the webinar this morning. So as we go through this, there are some literal questions here that can be asked to a service provider. No need to jot them down in their entirety right now. You will have these slides and can pull the questions then. So feel free to jot down what you'd like, but no worries if you're just listening along and not taking notes on these specific questions. So questions to identify potential conflicts of interest. I'd like to lay out that any service provider that you're working with should certainly be should be open to answering questions posed, whether that's in a more formal RFI or RFP or a less formal questionnaire. If a provider is not willing to provide a response to those types of questions, that right there should be a red flag to you. Any service provider in the context of your retirement program should understand and acknowledge that you, the plan sponsor, has a fiduciary duty to identify conflicts of interest, and refusing to help you fulfill that fiduciary duty is an issue. So without covering any of these questions individually in detail, what you can see as you read through them is there a little bit more broad questions than outright asking, what are your conflicts of interest? Please disclose your conflicts of interest. Because where conflicts do exist and where plan providers identify those conflicts, that question can and will be answered. But simply requesting that disclosure does not completely satisfy your fiduciary obligation to assess the services and products that your plan is receiving. Because whether or not those conflicts are acknowledged by the service provider, they may exist. There are different opinions on what a conflict of interest might be. And at the same time, litigation can be brought about whether or not there is an outright conflict of interest that exists. The perception alone of a conflict of interest could be cause for litigation. And let's be honest with ourselves here, even if it's perfectly defensible and there is no actual conflict that exists, as soon as litigation is brought about, there are large costs associated with fighting that litigation, as well as the resources and time that are drained by building a case. And so spending the appropriate amount of time outright identifying where there may be potential conflicts of interest helps alleviate that risk quite a bit. Slide 4 here, another set of questions that we feel are appropriate to ask your service providers, whether that's the plan's consultant or a record keeper or some other provider. But these questions are more geared towards specific participant services that are offered. So an example that we'll use that's actually very relevant and timely, a number of callers today work with TIAA as a record keeper. And TIAA offers a managed account service for its plan sponsor clients. Like any managed account service, it does come with a fee, and there are other dynamics to the managed account service that should be thoroughly evaluated before those services are delivered to clients. The first and most obvious being, is this an appropriate service to offer our participants? And Plan Pilot's worked with a number of our clients in assessing TIA's managed account service, and our conclusion based on our analysis was yes, this can be an appropriate service to offer for employees that do need the type of hands-on attention that a managed account service provides. Does that mean that it's appropriate for all participants? No, it's appropriate for a certain employee demographic. And for that reason, another question is, do participants have the ability to opt out of that service that's being offered? And in the case of TIA's managed account service, absolutely. Rather than an opt-out feature, it's actually an opt-in feature where a participant must actively choose to utilize the service rather than it being pressed upon them. Lastly, fees associated with a managed account service, in this case, TIAA's service. There's an explicit fee to use the service, hence why it's an opt-in versus an opt-out service for plan participants. But what's required is a fiduciary has some level of oversight over whether that fee is appropriate and what that fee is directed to and who it is paying, to ensure that the fee for the service is the fee that's paying for just that, and that no potential for conflict exists. Tying back to the TIA example, with Plan Pilot's assistance, we and our plan sponsor clients identified that yes, the fees for TIA's managed account service were largely appropriate and in line with the industry standard, and we could direct what percent and what portion of those fees was going to support what facet of that program, ensuring that there was no cross-selling going on, that there's no indirect or soft dollar compensation being provided to either TIAA or the engine that's supporting that managed account service. So just one example, really homing in on one of the questions posed on this page, but the idea is to give you a little bit better insight of the way to look at these types of things and the way to start evaluating whether conflicts of interest might exist. Because candidly, if you ask for a full list of conflicts of interest, you're not going to get the straightforward full answer, and that's just by nature of a few different things. Jumping to the next slide here, questions related to participant services. Oh, excuse me, this is a repeat of the page we just visited here. Sorry, jumping to the next slide, participant education, balancing risks with outcomes. So this is taking things in a little bit of a different direction, but again, remaining tied closely to the idea of participant services and ensuring that the best interests of participants are being delivered with any service or product that's being offered. And so on this page, we focus on disseminating the differences between providing participant education to plan participants versus providing investment or plan advice to participants. You as the plan sponsor have a fiduciary obligation to serve in your client's best interests, but where you could inadvertently be acting under a fiduciary umbrella is by providing your participants with investment advice related to the plan and related to their choices within the plan. The issue here is once you've crossed that threshold from providing education to providing outright advice, you have taken on fiduciary responsibility for the outcomes of the decisions that you push that participant into with the advice providing. So what really is the distinction and where is the line drawn with education? Our sub bullet points here do a good job broadly encompassing what participant education is really tailored around, aiding in their understanding of the plan and increasing their engagement to help improve their decision making. So things like basic plan information, how to sign up for the plan, the investments that are available in the plan, the performance numbers, the historical performance results of the investments in the plan, the expenses, the asset class dynamics of the plan, some general information around what is an equity fund, what is a bond fund, what are the differences there, and what considerations should a plan participant have when assessing those types of vehicles. Interactive materials, things like questionnaires that help a plan participant better gauge where they're at from a retirement readiness perspective, or where, based on their age, their risk tolerance might be for selecting investments. these are types of education that you can provide to your participants that certainly do not constitute advice and do improve participant engagement and improve decision making. As soon as you start directing a participant to, say, a certain service or a certain investment model, and begin providing more hands-on attention, that's where the line is crossed. And from an outsider's perspective, it becomes more of an advice versus an education dynamic. So that said, we strongly discourage plan sponsors from providing investment advice to their participants. And that's not to say that investment advice is a bad thing, but we think it's best positioned coming from an independent third party that can provide more hands-on advice without, as a fiduciary, misdirecting your plan participants. And so, like any other service provider, a consultant, an advisor, a plan's record keeper, there are independent third-party educators out there, but we would caution you, the plan sponsor, in identifying who those parties are, to certainly spend some time distinguishing whether they are conflict-free, because working directly with participants, if there are conflicts involved, it can be hugely detrimental. So this type of service provider specifically should be conflict-free. And the way to determine whether those conflict exists ties back to what we've discussed so far here today, is having process and documentation in place to ensure that that provider was thoroughly vetted, that any reasonable conflicts of interest have been assessed, and if they've been identified, they've been disclosed. And again, ensuring that the fees for the services being provided are reasonable. The last slide here, just a bit of background on Plan Pilot for those of you on the line who are new to us today. Plan Pilot, we're focused exclusively on serving our defined contribution 401k, 403b, and 457 plan clients. And that word exclusively is important here. We do pride ourselves in having always had a conflict-free service models for our sponsors and participants. All of our firm's revenue comes directly from our clients, and that is fully intentional. Even the perception of a conflict of interest to us is unnecessary stress on a relationship and can present an issue. So we are very intentional in our conflict-free approach, and we accept responsibility as a co-fiduciary for all of our plan sponsor clients' investments and the recommendations that we make. So with that, we have a few minutes here. Before I go ahead and close out the webinar, I'd like to invite any questions that participants on the line might have at this time. Feel free to go ahead and type those in. And if questions do come up after the call, we can certainly get those answered for you. Again, I will mention we will follow up with everyone on the line today with the slides from today's call for you to review and share with others. But equally as importantly, some of those questions that we did present here that you can use in a more formal RFI or questionnaire process with your providers. Okay, not seeing any questions at this time, but again, feel free to shoot them over afterwards if they do come up. Certainly appreciate the time that everyone's taken on the call today, especially for those who are on your lunch hours. Thank you for taking your lunch hour to spend some time with us. But for everyone on the line, again, we certainly appreciate the time. Hope you learned a thing or two today, and look forward to continued conversations. Take care.